The night was December 18th, 1972. Over the city of Hanoi, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, a sound began to grow, a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the bones of every man, woman, and child huddled in the shelters below. It was a sound they had learned to fear more than any other. The sound of 8 turbofan engines, multiplied by dozens, then hundreds. The sound of the B-52 Stratofortress. Lieutenant Colonel James McCarthy sat in the cockpit of his aircraft, call-sign Charcoal 1, leading a formation of 3 bombers toward the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. Through the reinforced glass, he could see nothing but darkness and the faint glow of instruments. But he knew what waited below. He had studied the intelligence reports, he had memorized the coordinates. And he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that what they were about to attempt had never been done before. The mission was called Operation Linebacker 2. Its purpose was simple in concept and devastating in execution: to bomb North Vietnam into accepting peace terms at the Paris negotiations. After years of gradual escalation, limited strikes, and political constraints, the full weight of American air power was about to be unleashed. For 11 consecutive nights, waves of B-52s would rain destruction on Hanoi and Haiphong, dropping more tonnage than had fallen on any target since the Second World War. But this was not 1945. The enemy below was not Japan, shattered and defenseless. North Vietnam had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Their air defense network was the most sophisticated outside the Soviet Union itself, a layered system of radar stations, surface-to-air missile batteries, anti-aircraft artillery, and MiG interceptors that had already claimed dozens of American aircraft. The skies over Hanoi were not empty space to be crossed. They were a killing ground. McCarthy checked his instruments one final time. Altitude, 36,000 feet. Speed, 450 knots. Time to target, 18 minutes. Behind him, his electronic warfare officer monitored the threat receivers, watching for the telltale signatures of enemy radar. The crew had trained for this mission for months. They had practiced the routes, memorized the timing, rehearsed every contingency. But training was one thing. Reality was something else entirely. The first indication that something was wrong came at 1943 local time. A warning light flashed on the instrument panel. A fan-song radar had locked onto their aircraft. Somewhere below, a SA-2 guideline missile was being prepared for launch. McCarthy felt his stomach tighten, but he held course. The mission parameters were clear: no evasive action until bombs were released. Any deviation would throw off the timing of the entire formation. 30 seconds later, the sky erupted. From the ground, it looked like the stars themselves were falling. Hundreds of SA-2 missiles streaked upward, their rocket motors leaving trails of white smoke against the black night. The North Vietnamese had been waiting. They had conserved their missiles for weeks, knowing that the Americans would eventually come in force. Now they unleashed everything they had. McCarthy watched as a missile detonated 200 meters to his left, close enough to illuminate the cockpit with its flash. His aircraft shuddered from the shockwave, but held together. Others were not so fortunate. Across the formation, B-52s began to fall from the sky. Great, lumbering giants transformed in an instant into cascades of burning metal and fuel. Each aircraft carried 6 men. Each explosion meant 6 lives extinguished in a heartbeat. The bomber stream pressed on. They had no choice. The bombs had to fall. At 2017, McCarthy's aircraft reached the release point. The bomb bay doors opened, and 42 750-pound bombs dropped into the darkness below. Seconds later, explosions rippled across the Kin No railroad yards, obliterating tracks, warehouses, and anything else within a half-mile radius. The destruction was complete and absolute. But as McCarthy banked his aircraft toward the relative safety of the Gulf of Tonkin, he understood something that would take the nation months to fully grasp. They had delivered their payload. They had hit their targets. They had demonstrated that American air power could strike anywhere, any time, with devastating force. And yet, even as the fires burned below, he knew this was not victory. It was simply the latest chapter in a war that had already consumed 50,000 American lives and showed no signs of ending. A war where the most powerful air force in human history had been bombing a small agricultural nation for 7 years without achieving its strategic objectives. A war that had begun with confidence and escalated into something no one fully understood. The B-52 was designed to carry nuclear weapons across the Soviet Union, to end civilization itself if ordered to do so. It was the ultimate expression of American technological superiority, a machine so powerful that its mere existence was supposed to deter any adversary from challenging the United States. Now it was being used to destroy railroad junctions and truck depots in a country that had no strategic bombers, no aircraft carriers, and no nuclear weapons of its own. How had it come to this? How had the mightiest air power ever assembled found itself locked in a grinding, inconclusive struggle against an enemy that refused to be defeated? The answer lay not in the skies over Hanoi, but in the decisions made years earlier, decisions that had gradually, inexorably, drawn the United States into a conflict it could neither win nor abandon. The story of the B-52 in Vietnam is not simply a story of bombs and targets, of sorties flown and tonnage dropped. It is a story about the limits of power itself, about the assumption that enough force, applied with enough precision, could bend any adversary to America's will, and about the gradual, painful realization that some problems cannot be solved from 30,000 feet. This is that story. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week, we uncover the hidden truths of history that mainstream narratives ignore. Stories that reveal what power really means and what it costs. Subscribe now so you never miss a single revelation. To understand what happened over Vietnam, one must first understand the weapon that made it possible. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress was not merely an aircraft. It was a philosophy made manifest, the belief that technology could solve any problem, that industrial capacity could overwhelm any enemy, that the nation capable of building enough machines would inevitably prevail. The bomber's origins stretched back to 1946, when the Cold War was just beginning to crystallize into its familiar shape. The Soviet Union had emerged from World War II as a continental power with millions of men under arms and an ideology that proclaimed itself destined to conquer the world. The United States, having pioneered the atomic bomb, saw strategic bombardment as the key to containing this new threat. What was needed was an aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory. A weapon so devastating that Moscow would never dare to challenge American interests. The specifications were extraordinary for their time. The aircraft would need to fly higher than any Soviet interceptor could reach, farther than any previous bomber had traveled, and carry a payload heavy enough to destroy entire cities. It would need to operate in all weather conditions, penetrate the most sophisticated air defenses, and return safely to bases thousands of miles from its targets. No existing technology could meet these requirements. New technology would have to be invented. Boeing's engineers spent 6 years developing what would become the B-52. The aircraft went through dozens of design iterations, each one pushing the boundaries of what was aeronautically possible. The final result was a machine of almost surreal dimensions, 159 feet long, with a wingspan of 185 feet and a maximum takeoff weight exceeding 480,000 pounds. 8 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines provided thrust equivalent to 136,000 horsepower. The aircraft could fly at altitudes above 50,000 feet, cruise at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, and travel more than 8,000 miles without refueling. But raw capability was only part of the equation. The B-52 was also designed for survivability. Its airframe could withstand the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear detonation. Its electronics were hardened against radiation. Its multiple redundant systems meant that the aircraft could continue flying even after suffering significant damage. The bomber was built to survive the apocalypse and deliver its payload regardless of what the enemy threw at it. By 1955, the first operational B-52s were entering service with Strategic Air Command. Over the following decade, 744 of these aircraft were produced, forming the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent. They sat on alert at bases around the world, their crews trained to launch within minutes of receiving orders, their bomb bays loaded with weapons capable of incinerating millions of people in a single flash. The doctrine that governed their use was called mutual assured destruction. The logic was grimly simple. If the Soviet Union attacked the United States with nuclear weapons, the B-52 force would retaliate with overwhelming force, destroying Soviet cities and industrial capacity. The certainty of this response would deter any Soviet leader from starting a war in the first place. Peace would be maintained through the threat of annihilation. It was a strategy built entirely around the concept of total war, the kind of conflict where everything was at stake and nothing was held back. The B-52 was optimized for this scenario. It was not designed for limited wars, regional conflicts, or counterinsurgency operations. It was designed to end civilization if ordered to do so. And yet, by 1965, these apocalyptic weapons found themselves being deployed against a very different kind of enemy. The situation in South Vietnam had been deteriorating for years. What had begun as a low-level insurgency, supported by North Vietnam, had grown into a full-scale conflict, threatening to topple the American-backed government in Saigon. President Lyndon Johnson faced a stark choice: either intervene with significant military force or watch as communist forces took control of the entire country. Johnson chose intervention. But he also chose to impose strict limits on how that intervention would be conducted. There would be no declaration of war, no mobilization of reserves, no invasion of North Vietnam, and no use of nuclear weapons under any circumstances. The conflict would be limited, controlled, and calibrated to achieve specific political objectives without triggering a wider confrontation with the Soviet Union or China. This created an unprecedented situation for the military planners at Strategic Air Command. For the first time in history, they were being asked to use their most powerful conventional weapons in a war defined by restraint. The B-52, built to deliver megatons of nuclear destruction, would now be dropping conventional bombs on jungle trails and suspected enemy positions. It was like using a sledgehammer to perform surgery. The first B-52 missions over South Vietnam, designated Arc Light, began on June 18, 1965. 30 bombers took off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, flew 2,500 miles across the Pacific Ocean, and released their payloads over a suspected Viet Cong concentration in Binh Duong province. The results were ambiguous. Bomb damage assessment teams found destroyed jungle and cratered earth, but little evidence of enemy casualties. The Viet Cong had apparently dispersed before the strike. This pattern would repeat itself thousands of times over the following years. The B-52s would receive intelligence about enemy positions. They would fly their missions with mechanical precision. Their bombs would fall with devastating accuracy. And the enemy would survive, disperse, and return to fight another day. The problem was not with the aircraft or its crews. The problem was with the nature of the war itself. The Viet Cong, were not a conventional army that could be destroyed by conventional bombardment. They were guerrillas who operated in small units, moved constantly, and blended into the civilian population. They had no fixed positions to bomb, no supply depots to destroy, no industrial infrastructure to target. They were everywhere and nowhere, an enemy that could not be seen from 30,000 feet. The North Vietnamese army presented a more conventional target, but they too had adapted to American air power. Their troops moved at night, hid in tunnels during the day, and dispersed whenever aircraft were detected overhead. Their supply lines ran through dense jungle along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of paths that could be bombed repeatedly without being permanently severed. Every crater was filled in. Every destroyed bridge was rebuilt. Every fallen tree was cleared away. The mathematics of the situation were stark. The United States was spending approximately $9 for every dollar of damage inflicted on the enemy. Thousands of sorties were being flown to destroy targets that could be replaced within days. The most sophisticated bombing campaign in history was being fought to a standstill by an enemy that had no air force, no navy, and no industrial capacity to speak of. And yet, the bombing continued. It continued because the alternative, admitting that air power could not achieve its objectives, was politically unacceptable. It continued because the military had no other strategy to offer. It continued because stopping would be seen as a sign of weakness that might embolden the enemy. It continued because, in the absence of victory, continued effort was the only substitute. The B-52 crews flew their missions with professionalism and courage. They faced dangers that their training had never prepared them for, not Soviet interceptors and nuclear war, but surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft fire in conflicts that had no clear front lines and no obvious path to victory. They dropped their bombs, returned to base, and prepared to do it again the next day. By 1968, more than 100,000 B-52 sorties had been flown over Southeast Asia. More than 2 million tons of bombs had been dropped, more than all the bombs dropped by all nations in all of World War II combined, and the war was no closer to being won than it had been at the beginning. The machine of war had been built to perfection, but perfecting the machine had not been enough. Deep in the mountains of Laos, far from any city or village, a network of paths wound through the jungle like the veins of some vast hidden organism. This was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the logistical backbone of the North Vietnamese war effort, the conduit through which men, weapons and supplies flowed south to sustain the fight against the American-backed government in Saigon. The trail was not a single road, but a complex system of interconnected routes, stretching more than 1,000 miles from the mountain passes of North Vietnam to the border regions of South Vietnam and Cambodia. Some sections were paved roads capable of handling trucks. Others were narrow paths that could only be traversed on foot or by bicycle. All of them were hidden beneath triple canopy jungle so dense that sunlight rarely reached the ground. For the American military planners, the trail represented both the key to victory and the source of endless frustration. If the flow of supplies could be stopped, the reasoning went, the insurgency in the South would wither and die. Without ammunition, without weapons, without reinforcements, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army units operating below the demilitarized zone would eventually be defeated. The war would end, not through the destruction of the enemy's forces, but through the strangulation of their supply lines. This logic led to one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in human history. Operation Steel Tiger, Operation Tiger Hound, Operation Commando Hunt, the names changed, but the objective remained constant: destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Between 1965 and 1973, more than 3 million tons of bombs would fall on Laos alone, making it the most heavily bombed country per capita in world history. The B-52s played a central role in this campaign. Their ability to carry massive payloads made them ideal for carpet bombing, saturating large areas with explosives in hopes of catching enemy convoys, destroying supply caches, or simply making the trail impassable. A single B-52 could drop up to 108 bombs in a pattern nearly 2 miles long and half a mile wide. 30 bombers flying in formation could devastate an area the size of a small city. Lieutenant Colonel William Peterson commanded a B-52 squadron based at U Tapao Air Base in Thailand. His aircraft flew missions over the trail 3 or 4 times per week, each sortie lasting 8 to 12 hours. The targets were always the same: suspected truck parks, storage areas, and choke points along the supply routes. The bomb damage assessments were always encouraging: hundreds of trucks destroyed, thousands of tons of supplies eliminated, entire sections of trail rendered impassable. And yet the supplies kept flowing. Peterson eventually understood what the intelligence reports failed to capture. The North Vietnamese had turned the maintenance of the Ho Chi Minh Trail into a national enterprise. More than 300,000 workers, soldiers, civilians, and youth volunteers labored constantly to repair bomb damage, build alternate routes, and keep the supply lines open. They worked at night, by hand, with nothing more than shovels and baskets. Every crater was filled. Every fallen tree was cleared. Every destroyed bridge was replaced with a ford or a pontoon crossing. The Americans bombed the trail by day, the Vietnamese rebuilt it by night. It was a contest between industrial technology and human determination, and determination was proving to be the stronger force. The futility of the campaign was captured in a single statistic that would later become infamous. American analysts estimated that North Vietnam needed to move approximately 100 tons of supplies per day down the trail to sustain its operations in the south. Despite years of bombing, despite millions of tons of ordnance expended, despite the most sophisticated interdiction effort in military history, the flow of supplies never dropped below 400 tons per day. The enemy was not just surviving the bombing, they were increasing their capacity in spite of it. The reasons for this failure were both tactical and strategic. Tactically, the jungle canopy made it nearly impossible to locate targets from the air. Truck convoys moved at night with their headlights off, guided by personnel who knew every twist and turn of the route. Supply caches were hidden in caves, buried underground, or dispersed among hundreds of small sites that could never all be found. The trail itself was constantly shifting, with new routes being constructed even as old ones were being bombed. Strategically, the bombing campaign suffered from a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's resolve. American planners assumed that at some point, the cost of maintaining the trail would exceed the North Vietnamese willingness to bear it. They assumed that enough destruction would eventually break the enemy's will. They assumed that a society could only absorb so much punishment before it surrendered. These assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. The North Vietnamese were fighting for what they believed was their national survival and the reunification of their country. They were willing to accept casualties and hardships that seemed incomprehensible to American analysts accustomed to calculating cost-benefit ratios. The bombing did not break their will. It hardened it. Every crater, every destroyed village, every dead comrade became another reason to fight on. Master Sergeant Nguyen Van Tao was one of the 300,000 workers who maintained the trail. He had been assigned to a road repair unit in 1967 and would remain there until the war ended. His job was simple: fill bomb craters and clear debris so that trucks could pass. He worked 12-hour shifts, slept in underground bunkers, and ate rice that was carried on foot from supply points dozens of miles away. In later years, Thao would describe the experience without bitterness or pride, simply as something that had to be done. The bombs fell every day, the road was destroyed every night, and every morning they rebuilt it. This was their duty, their contribution to the war. If they stopped, the soldiers in the South would have no ammunition. If they stopped, the war would be lost, so they did not stop. The American pilots who flew the missions over the trail were not unaware of this reality. Many of them came to understand over months and years of repetitive sorties that they were engaged in a Sisyphean task, rolling a boulder up a hill that would only roll back down again. They dropped their bombs, filed their reports, and watched as the same targets appeared on their mission briefs week after week. The trail that was supposed to be destroyed kept appearing on the reconnaissance photos, as alive as ever. If this story is touching something deep inside you, if you feel the weight of what these men endured on both sides of this war, leave a comment right now saying, "War shows us both the best and worst of humanity." I want to know if you understand what I'm trying to share with you here. The psychological toll of this endless, seemingly futile effort was significant. Some crews became cynical, viewing their missions as exercises in bureaucratic compliance rather than meaningful military operations. Others maintained their faith in the larger strategy, believing that their efforts were contributing to victory even if the results were not immediately visible. All of them continued to fly, continued to risk their lives, continued to drop their bombs into the green void below. By 1972, the total ordnance expended over the Ho Chi Minh Trail exceeded 2 million tons. The cost, in 1970s dollars, was approximately $7 billion, and the trail remained open, carrying more supplies than ever before. The machine had met its match, not in enemy technology or firepower, but in human endurance and the willingness to suffer. The failure to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail forced American strategists to confront an uncomfortable question. If the enemy's supply lines could not be severed, what purpose was the bombing actually serving? The answer they developed would shape the remainder of the air war and ultimately define its moral legacy. The concept was called graduated escalation. Rather than seeking to achieve a decisive military victory, the bombing would be used as a tool of political coercion. By gradually increasing the intensity and scope of the attacks, the United States would demonstrate its willingness to inflict unlimited destruction. At some point, the reasoning went. North Vietnam would conclude that the cost of continuing the war exceeded any possible benefit and would agree to negotiate on American terms. This doctrine rested on several assumptions. First, that North Vietnam was a rational actor capable of making cost-benefit calculations. Second, that there existed a threshold of destruction beyond which the North Vietnamese leadership would choose surrender over continued resistance. Third, that American domestic opinion would support a prolonged bombing campaign long enough for this threshold to be reached. Fourth, that international pressure, particularly from the Soviet Union and China, would not complicate the strategy. Each of these assumptions would prove to be either partially or completely wrong. The bombing campaign against North Vietnam proper, as opposed to the trail in Laos, began in March 1965 with Operation Rolling Thunder. The original plan called for a brief, intense air offensive that would quickly bring Hanoi to the negotiating table. Instead, Rolling Thunder would continue for more than 3 years, involve over 300,000 sorties, and drop nearly 1 million tons of bombs on North Vietnam, all without achieving its stated objectives. The restrictions imposed on the campaign revealed the fundamental contradiction at its heart. Fearing Chinese or Soviet intervention, the Johnson administration prohibited attacks on many of the most strategically significant targets: the port of Haiphong, where Soviet ships delivered military supplies, the dike system that protected the agricultural heartland, and the industrial facilities concentrated around Hanoi. Pilots were given detailed rules of engagement, specifying which targets they could attack, which weapons they could use, and which approaches they could fly. These restrictions made sense from a political perspective. The last thing the United States needed was a repetition of Korea, where Chinese intervention had transformed a limited conflict into a much larger war. But from a military perspective, they rendered the bombing campaign incoherent. The enemy's most important assets were protected by political sanctuary. The pain being inflicted, while severe, was not severe enough to compel surrender. The North Vietnamese quickly adapted to this reality. They dispersed their industry, buried their supplies, and evacuated their cities. The population learned to live with the bombing, not because it was tolerable, but because they had no choice. Every attack was portrayed as further evidence of American barbarism, fueling the narrative of righteous resistance against foreign aggression. Meanwhile, the costs to the United States were mounting. Aircraft losses over North Vietnam reached alarming levels. Between 1965 and 1968, nearly 900 American aircraft were shot down, and hundreds of pilots were killed or captured. The North Vietnamese air defense system, continuously upgraded with Soviet equipment and advisors, was proving far more effective than anticipated. What had been conceived as a low-risk demonstration of American resolve was becoming a grinding war of attrition in the skies. The B-52 force was initially excluded from operations over North Vietnam due to concerns about losses. The bombers were designed for high-altitude operations, where their defensive systems could protect them from interceptors. But North Vietnam's SA-2 surface-to-air missiles were specifically designed to engage high-altitude targets. Sending B-52s into this environment risked catastrophic losses that could undermine the entire nuclear deterrent posture. This calculation would change in December 1972, when President Richard Nixon ordered the Linebacker II campaign. By then, the political situation had shifted dramatically. American ground forces were being withdrawn. The Paris peace talks had stalled. Nixon needed to demonstrate that the United States could still inflict decisive damage if North Vietnam refused to negotiate in good faith. The B-52s would be the instrument of this demonstration. The planning for Linebacker II reflected lessons learned from 7 years of unsuccessful air operations. This time, there would be no graduated escalation. The full force would be committed from the beginning. Targets that had previously been off-limits, including facilities in downtown Hanoi and Haiphong, would now be struck. The objective was not to coerce through gradual pressure, but to devastate through overwhelming force. Colonel James McCarthy, the pilot who led the first wave, had been briefed on what to expect. Intelligence estimated that North Vietnam possessed approximately 200 SA-2 missiles and would be able to fire roughly 100 per night. The B-52 formations, flying at night and at high altitude, would present difficult targets. Losses would be acceptable, perhaps 1 or 2 aircraft per mission. The bombing would continue for 3 to 5 days, after which North Vietnam would presumably agree to return to the negotiating table. These estimates proved optimistic. The North Vietnamese had been stockpiling missiles for exactly this contingency. On the first night, they launched more than 200 SA-2s at the incoming bomber stream. 3 B-52s were shot down. On the second night, 3 more. By the third night, 6 aircraft had been lost, a rate that, if continued, would destroy the entire B-52 force within weeks. The losses forced a tactical reassessment. The original flight plans had been designed for nuclear war scenarios, where predictable approaches were acceptable because the targets would be destroyed in a single pass. Against a conventional enemy with a functioning air defense system, this predictability was suicidal. The North Vietnamese had learned the bomber routes and were positioning their missiles accordingly. New tactics were developed. Flight paths were randomized, electronic countermeasures were enhanced, fighter escorts were increased. The bombing runs were compressed into shorter time windows to minimize exposure to enemy defenses. These adaptations reduced losses significantly. Only 2 B-52s were shot down in the remaining 8 nights of the campaign. When Linebacker 2 ended on December 29, 1972, more than 700 B-52 sorties had been flown. Approximately 15,000 tons of bombs had been dropped on Hanoi and Haiphong. 15 B-52s had been lost, along with 12 other aircraft. 93 American airmen were dead or missing. The destruction on the ground was extensive. Railroad yards, power plants, communications facilities, and military installations had been heavily damaged or destroyed. But the claims of precision were undermined by the reality of high-altitude bombing. Despite efforts to avoid civilian areas, bombs inevitably fell on residential neighborhoods, hospitals, and other non-military targets. North Vietnamese sources claimed that more than 1,600 civilians were killed in Hanoi alone. The international reaction was immediate and harshly critical. America's European allies condemned the bombing as disproportionate and counterproductive. Pope Paul VI called it a renewed outbreak of violence. The editorial pages of major newspapers around the world described it as terror bombing, carpet bombing, Christmas bombing, an atrocity that undermined whatever moral authority the United States still possessed. And yet, within weeks of the campaign's conclusion, North Vietnam returned to the Paris negotiations. A peace agreement was signed on January 27, 1973. American prisoners of war were released. The remaining American forces were withdrawn. The war, it seemed, was finally over. Nixon and his supporters claimed vindication. The bombing had worked. North Vietnam had been forced to accept terms they had previously rejected. American air power had achieved through 11 days of intensive strikes what years of graduated escalation had failed to accomplish. Critics disputed this interpretation. They pointed out that the terms of the January 1973 agreement were essentially identical to those North Vietnam had offered in October 1972, before Linebacker 2. The bombing had not changed Hanoi's negotiating position. It had merely provided a face-saving mechanism for the United States to accept terms it would have rejected as surrender months earlier. The truth, as with so much about the Vietnam War, lay somewhere between these two narratives. Linebacker 2 had demonstrated that unrestricted air power could inflict devastating damage on North Vietnam. It had also demonstrated that such damage was not sufficient to compel unconditional surrender. The bombing had hastened the end of American involvement in the war. It had not determined the war's ultimate outcome. That outcome would become clear 2 years later, when North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. Statistics tell one story. Numbers of sorties, tons of ordnance, aircraft lost, targets destroyed. These are the metrics by which military campaigns are traditionally measured. But the B-52 campaign over Vietnam was also a human experience, lived by tens of thousands of individuals whose stories rarely appear in the official histories. Captain Robert Certain was a B-52 navigator who flew missions over both South Vietnam and the North during Linebacker 2. His aircraft was shot down on December 18, 1972, the first night of the campaign. The SA-2 missile detonated just below the aircraft's fuselage, severing control cables and igniting fuel tanks. Certain ejected at 30,000 feet over downtown Hanoi and descended through a sky filled with anti-aircraft fire and the burning wreckage of his own bomber. He landed in a rice paddy on the outskirts of the city. Within minutes, he was surrounded by armed militiamen and civilian onlookers. The anger in their faces was unmistakable. For 7 years, they had lived under American bombs. Now, one of the bombers had fallen into their hands, Certain expected to be killed. Instead, he was captured, bound, and transported to the infamous Hoa Lo prison, known to American POWs as the Hanoi Hilton. There, he joined hundreds of other American airmen who had been shot down over the preceding years. The conditions were harsh. Solitary confinement, limited food, physical abuse, and psychological pressure to confess to war crimes or make propaganda statements. The experience of captivity varied widely depending on when a prisoner was captured and the broader political context. Early captures from 1965 to 1969 faced the worst treatment. Torture was routine. Many prisoners were permanently injured. A few died from their injuries or committed suicide. Later captures, particularly during and after Linebacker 2, received relatively better treatment as North Vietnam sought to maintain international sympathy and position itself advantageously for post-war relations. Certain survived 6 months of captivity before being released as part of the Operation Homecoming prisoner exchange in 1973. He returned to a country deeply divided over the war. To some, a hero who had served his nation under impossible circumstances. To others, a participant in an unjust campaign that had caused immeasurable suffering to innocent people. The moral complexity of the B-52 crewmen's experience has never been fully resolved. They were professional soldiers following lawful orders in a war authorized by their elected government. They had no control over the political decisions that shaped the conflict or the tactical directives that governed their missions. Many of them believed genuinely that they were fighting to defend freedom and prevent the spread of communism, values they had been taught to cherish since childhood. At the same time, they were instruments of a bombing campaign that killed tens of thousands of Vietnamese civilians. The bombs they dropped did not distinguish between soldiers and farmers, military installations and family homes. The doctrine of strategic bombing, whatever its theoretical justifications, resulted in the deaths of people who had no connection to the military decisions being targeted. Technical Sergeant Samuel Turner was an enlisted crew member who served on B-52s throughout the war. His job was to maintain the aircraft's defensive systems, the electronic countermeasures that might mean the difference between survival and death when the missiles started flying. He flew more than 200 combat missions over Southeast Asia, each one lasting 8 to 12 hours, each one carrying him over territory where any malfunction could result in death or capture. Turner never questioned the missions. That was not his role. His role was to keep the equipment functioning so that the aircraft could complete its assigned tasks and return safely to base. The larger questions, whether the war was just, whether the bombing was effective, whether the suffering being inflicted was proportionate to any conceivable objective. These were matters for politicians and generals, not for the men who actually flew the missions. And yet, those questions could not be entirely suppressed. In the long hours over the Pacific, in the brief moments before sleep, in the quiet conversations among crewmates, the doubts surfaced. What were they actually accomplishing? How many more missions would it take? Was any of this making a difference? Turner completed his tour and returned to civilian life in 1970. He never talked about his experiences, even to his family. Like many veterans of the conflict, he buried the memories and tried to move on. The war had been something that happened to him, something he had survived, but not something he wanted to relive or examine too closely. The Vietnamese experience of the bombing was, of course, radically different. For them, the B-52s were not weapons in a strategic contest, but harbingers of death that could arrive without warning at any moment. The sound of their engines, a deep subsonic rumble that could be felt before it was heard, became associated with terror throughout North Vietnam and the areas of the South where Arc Light missions were conducted. Nguyen Thi Binh was 12 years old when the first B-52 strikes hit her village in Quang Tri province in 1967. The bombs fell at night, while she and her family were sleeping. She remembered the ground shaking, the sound of explosions rolling across the countryside like continuous thunder, and the screams of neighbors trapped in collapsed buildings. When morning came, the village that had been her home no longer existed. Craters filled the spaces where houses had stood. Bodies lay in the wreckage, some burned beyond recognition. Her family survived because their shelter had been dug deep into the earth. a precaution that had been recommended by party cadres months earlier. Other families had not been so fortunate or so prescient. 27 people died in that single raid, in a village that had no military significance whatsoever. The target, according to American records, had been a suspected supply cache 2 kilometers away. The bombs had fallen short. Bin spent the rest of the war in various refugee camps, moving whenever the bombing intensified. She lost her father to another airstrike in 1969 and her brother to the fighting around Saigon in 1975. By the time the war ended, she was a young woman who had known nothing but conflict for her entire conscious life. In later years, she would speak of the Americans without hatred, but also without forgiveness. They had killed her father and destroyed her home. They had done so from such a great distance that they probably never knew she existed. This combination of devastating personal impact and complete impersonal anonymity was perhaps the most psychologically difficult aspect of the bombing to process. There was no enemy face to hate, no human decision to blame, only the abstract malevolence of machines dropping death from the sky. The total human cost of the B-52 campaign over Vietnam has never been definitively calculated. North Vietnamese sources claim that American bombing killed approximately 52,000 civilians in the north during the entire war, though Western analysts consider this figure to be imprecise. The casualties in South Vietnam and Laos were certainly higher, but even more difficult to document, given the chaos of the conflict and the impossibility of distinguishing between deaths caused by different weapon systems. What can be said with certainty is that the bombing transformed the lives of millions of people. It drove populations from their homes, destroyed agricultural systems that had sustained communities for generations, and left physical and psychological scars that persist to this day. The craters that dot the Vietnamese and Laotian countryside remain visible from the air, permanent monuments to a campaign that lasted less than a decade, but whose consequences will endure for centuries. The B-52 crews returned home to lives that were, for the most part, ordinary. They married, raised families, pursued careers, grew old. Most of them processed their experiences in private, sharing memories only with fellow veterans who could understand the particular mixture of pride, guilt, and confusion that characterized their service. They had done their duty as they understood it. Whether that duty had been worthy of the sacrifice, theirs and their enemies, was a question that each man had to answer for himself. One of the enduring myths of the Vietnam Air War was the concept of precision bombing. American officials consistently emphasized the surgical nature of the strikes, the sophisticated targeting systems employed, and the earnest efforts made to minimize civilian casualties. The B-52 was presented not as an indiscriminate weapon of mass destruction, but as a precision instrument capable of striking military targets while leaving civilian areas untouched. The reality was considerably different. The B-52 was designed for nuclear war, where precision was largely irrelevant. A nuclear weapon could destroy an entire city. Whether it detonated directly over the target or a mile away made little practical difference. The aircraft's bombing systems reflected this nuclear heritage. They were optimized for range and reliability rather than accuracy. When carrying conventional bombs, a B-52 could achieve a circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of bombs could be expected to fall, of approximately 400 meters under optimal conditions. This meant that even when everything worked perfectly, half of the bombs would land more than a quarter mile from the intended target. In practice, factors such as weather, equipment malfunctions, navigation errors, and human mistakes frequently degraded accuracy even further. The nature of the targets in Vietnam exacerbated this limitation. Enemy forces did not occupy fixed positions that could be clearly identified and precisely struck. They dispersed through the jungle, hid in villages, and moved constantly to avoid detection. Bombing missions were often planned based on intelligence that was hours or days old, meaning that the targets had frequently relocated before the bombs arrived. The solution to this problem was area bombing, saturating large swaths of territory with explosives in hopes of catching the enemy somewhere within the blast zone. A single B-52 could devastate an area nearly 2 miles long and half a mile wide. 30 bombers flying in formation could carpet an area equivalent to several square miles. The probability of hitting any specific target was low, but the probability of hitting something was essentially guaranteed. This approach had certain military logic. If the enemy was hiding in the jungle and the precise location could not be determined, then destroying a sufficient area of jungle would inevitably destroy some enemy forces and supplies. The same principle had been applied with varying degrees of success in every major conflict since the invention of aircraft. Strategic bombing was inherently imprecise. Effectiveness was achieved through volume rather than accuracy. The problem was that the areas being bombed were not empty. Vietnam and Laos were among the most densely populated regions on Earth. Villages, farms, and hamlets dotted the landscape in patterns that had evolved over centuries. The jungle that concealed enemy forces also concealed civilian populations going about their daily lives. When the bombs fell, they did not distinguish between soldiers and farmers. The official policy was to avoid civilian casualties wherever possible. Target selection procedures theoretically required verification that proposed strike zones were free of non-combatants. Pilots were briefed on the importance of distinguishing between legitimate military targets and protected civilian areas. Rules of engagement specified criteria that had to be met before bombs could be released. In practice, these procedures were often overwhelmed by the operational tempo of the war. Intelligence was incomplete. Verification was impossible. The pressure to generate sortie numbers and demonstrate progress was relentless. Mistakes were made, not occasionally, but systematically. The same factors that made the enemy difficult to locate also made civilians difficult to protect. The village of Ben Suc in Binh Duong province illustrated the logical endpoint of this dynamic. Intelligence indicated that the village had become a base area for Viet Cong forces operating in the Iron Triangle. Rather than attempting to distinguish between combatants and civilians, American forces evacuated the entire population, 6,000 people, and then leveled the village with bombs and bulldozers. The inhabitants were relocated to refugee camps, where many would spend years waiting to return to homes that no longer existed. Ben Suc was an extreme case, but the logic behind it pervaded the entire bombing campaign. If the enemy could not be separated from the civilian population, then the civilian population would have to be separated from the enemy, by force if necessary. The bombers that flew over Vietnam were not merely weapons directed at military targets. They were instruments of population control, designed to make large areas of the country uninhabitable for anyone, combatant or civilian. The environmental impact of this approach was staggering. Thousands of square miles of forest were destroyed, either directly by explosives or indirectly through defoliation campaigns conducted in parallel with the bombing. The craters left by B-52 strikes filled with water and became breeding grounds for mosquitoes, contributing to malaria outbreaks that persisted for decades. The unexploded ordnance that litters the Vietnamese and Laotian countryside continues to kill and maim civilians to this day, more than 50 years after the bombs were dropped. None of this was intentional in the sense of being a deliberate policy goal. The commanders who planned the missions, the pilots who flew them, and the political leaders who authorized them did not set out to devastate the Vietnamese countryside or displace millions of civilians. They were pursuing military objectives using the tools available to them, within constraints imposed by political considerations they did not control. But intention and outcome are different things. The road to catastrophe is often paved with reasonable decisions, each one logical in isolation, that combine to produce results no one would have chosen if the full consequences had been visible from the beginning. The B-52 campaign over Vietnam was such a catastrophe, not because the men involved were evil or incompetent, but because the logic of the war itself led inexorably toward destruction on a scale that defied justification. The illusion of precision served a psychological function for those who waged the campaign. It allowed them to believe that they were conducting a clean war, a surgical war, a war in which the guilty were punished and the innocent protected. This belief was necessary for morale and for political sustainability. It was also, in fundamental ways, a lie. By the spring of 1973, the American war in Vietnam was officially over. The Paris Peace Accords had been signed. The prisoners had come home. The last combat troops had departed. After more than a decade of escalating involvement, the United States had extricated itself from the conflict that had consumed the nation's attention, divided its politics, and cost the lives of more than 58,000 of its young men. But the war itself was not over. It had merely entered a new phase, one in which the United States would play no direct role, but would watch with growing unease as the edifice it had spent so much blood and treasure to construct began to crumble. The South Vietnamese government, now solely responsible for its own defense, faced an enemy that had never accepted the Paris Accords as anything more than a tactical pause. North Vietnam used the ceasefire to rebuild its forces, repair the damage from Linebacker II, and prepare for the final offensive that would reunify the country under communist rule. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which American bombers had tried so desperately to sever, now operated openly, funneling men and equipment south at unprecedented rates. President Nixon had promised that American air power would return if North Vietnam violated the accords. This promise was never fulfilled. The Watergate scandal consumed Nixon's presidency and ultimately forced his resignation in August 1974. His successor, Gerald Ford, inherited a Congress and a public that had no appetite for renewed military involvement in Southeast Asia. When North Vietnam launched its final offensive in March 1975, the B-52s remained on their bases. The collapse, when it came, was swift and total. South Vietnamese forces, demoralized and undersupplied, offered only sporadic resistance. Province after province fell to the advancing North Vietnamese army. Refugees clogged the roads leading south, fleeing the communist advance in scenes that echoed the great displacements of World War II. The government in Saigon pleaded for American intervention that would never come. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war that had begun with American advisors in the late 1950s escalated through the bombing campaigns of the 1960s and wound down through the negotiations of the early 1970s, was finally over. Vietnam would be reunified under communist rule. The outcome that all the bombing, all the fighting, all the dying had been intended to prevent. For the men who had flown the B-52 missions, the fall of Saigon was a moment of profound disillusionment. They had risked their lives, watched their comrades die, and dropped millions of tons of bombs on a country most of them had never seen from the ground. They had been told that their efforts were essential to preventing communist expansion, protecting American credibility, and defending the freedom of the South Vietnamese people. Now all of it seemed to have been for nothing. Colonel James McCarthy, who had led the first wave of Linebacker II bombers over Hanoi, was serving at Strategic Air Command headquarters when Saigon fell. He watched the news coverage with a mixture of sadness and resignation. The images of helicopters evacuating the last Americans from the embassy roof, of desperate Vietnamese clinging to aircraft skids, of the victorious North Vietnamese soldiers raising their flag over the captured city. These images would stay with him for the rest of his life. What had it all been for? The question haunted not just McCarthy, but an entire generation of Americans who had served in Vietnam or supported the war from home. The bombing campaign that was supposed to demonstrate the limits of communist aggression had instead demonstrated the limits of American power. The technology that was supposed to guarantee victory had proven incapable of defeating an enemy that refused to be defeated. The B-52 remained in service, of course. The aircraft that had been designed to fight nuclear war continued to serve as the backbone of America's strategic deterrent. New models were developed, upgraded, modernized. The lessons of Vietnam were studied, analyzed, incorporated into revised doctrines and improved tactics. The Air Force learned from its mistakes and prepared for future conflicts that would, it was hoped, be fought more wisely. But the fundamental lesson of Vietnam, that air power alone cannot win wars against determined adversaries willing to accept unlimited casualties, proved difficult to internalize. The same confidence in technology, the same faith in the ability of sophisticated weapons to overcome political and human factors would resurface in future conflicts. The same mistakes would be made in different forms, in different places. The B-52s that flew over Vietnam are mostly gone now, replaced by newer aircraft or retired to museums and boneyards. A few remain in service, their airframes repeatedly upgraded, their mission adapted to the demands of a new century. They are flown by pilots who were not born when the last bombs fell on Hanoi, who learned about Vietnam in history classes rather than mission briefings. But the questions that the Vietnam bombing campaign raised have never been fully answered. Questions about the moral limits of air power, questions about the relationship between military force and political objectives, questions about what happens when the most powerful nation on Earth applies its full destructive capacity against an enemy that simply refuses to surrender. These questions echo through every subsequent conflict in which American air power has been employed. They will continue to echo as long as nations wage war and seek to impose their will through violence. The story of the B-52 in Vietnam is, ultimately, a story about the nature of power itself. It is a story about what power can accomplish and what it cannot, about the assumptions that lead nations to believe that enough force, applied with enough determination, can solve any problem, and about the painful discovery that some problems resist solution no matter how much force is applied. The United States entered the Vietnam conflict with confidence bordering on arrogance. It possessed the most powerful military in human history, backed by an industrial economy capable of producing weapons and ammunition in virtually unlimited quantities. Its air force could strike any target on Earth with devastating precision. Its technology was generations ahead of anything its adversaries could field. Victory, it seemed, was merely a matter of applying these capabilities effectively. This confidence was not entirely unjustified. American military power had, after all, played the decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The same strategic bombing doctrine that guided the Vietnam campaign had reduced German cities to rubble and Japanese industry to ashes. The atomic bombs that ended World War II were the ultimate expression of air power's potential, weapons so devastating that entire nations could be compelled to surrender by the threat of their use. But Vietnam was not World War II, and the North Vietnamese were not the Germans or the Japanese. They were fighting on their own soil for objectives they considered existential, against an enemy they viewed as a foreign invader continuing a century of colonial oppression. They could not be shocked into submission because they had already endured decades of warfare and accepted suffering as the price of independence. They could not be isolated from their allies because the Soviet Union and China provided steady streams of military and economic support. They could not be defeated on the battlefield because they refused to fight the kind of conventional war that American forces were designed to win. The B-52 campaign exemplified both the strengths and the limitations of American military power. The aircraft performed exactly as designed. The bombs fell where they were aimed. The targets that could be identified were destroyed. The tonnage dropped exceeded anything in previous military history. By any quantitative measure, the campaign was an impressive demonstration of industrial and technological capability. And yet it failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The enemy was not compelled to surrender. The supply lines were not severed. The will to resist was not broken. The war ended, not with American victory, but with American withdrawal, followed by the collapse of everything the United States had fought to preserve. The reasons for this failure are complex and continue to be debated by historians and military analysts. Some argue that the bombing was too restricted, that if political constraints had been removed earlier, if the full force of American air power had been unleashed from the beginning, the outcome might have been different. Others contend that the failure was inherent in the strategy itself, that no amount of bombing could have achieved objectives that were fundamentally political rather than military. What seems clear, with the benefit of hindsight, is that the United States fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict it was fighting. The war in Vietnam was not primarily a military contest that could be won through the application of superior firepower. It was a political struggle for the loyalty of the Vietnamese people, a struggle in which bombs were more likely to create enemies than to eliminate them. Every village destroyed, every civilian killed, every family displaced by the bombing became a recruitment tool for the other side. The very weapons that were supposed to demonstrate American resolve instead demonstrated American indifference to Vietnamese lives. The technology that was supposed to win hearts and minds instead hardened hearts and focused minds on resistance. This dynamic was not invisible to American leaders at the time. Intelligence reports documented the counterproductive effects of the bombing. Military analysts questioned whether the strategy was achieving its objectives. Political advisors warned that the costs were exceeding any conceivable benefits. But the bombing continued anyway, driven by institutional momentum, political calculation, and the absence of any alternative strategy that seemed more promising. The men who flew the B-52 missions were not responsible for these strategic failures. They were soldiers following orders, doing their duty as they understood it, risking their lives in service to their country. Many of them had doubts about the wisdom of the campaign, but expressing those doubts was not part of their job description. Their job was to fly the missions, drop the bombs, and return safely to base. This they did, with professionalism and courage, for nearly a decade. The legacy they left behind is complicated. The craters that scar the Vietnamese landscape are monuments to their efforts and to the suffering those efforts caused. The unexploded ordnance that continues to kill and maim is a reminder that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield and far beyond the lifetimes of those who fight. The memories of survivors on both sides carry wounds that no peace treaty can heal, but there is also a legacy of lessons learned, however imperfectly. The Vietnam experience forced the American military to confront the limitations of air power and to develop more nuanced doctrines for future conflicts. It demonstrated that technological superiority is not sufficient for victory and that political objectives must guide military strategy rather than the reverse. It showed that the costs of war, human, economic, and moral, must be weighed against realistic assessments of what war can actually achieve. These lessons have been applied with varying degrees of success in subsequent conflicts. They have also been forgotten, ignored, or overridden when political pressures demanded military action regardless of the prospects for success. The tension between what air power can do and what it should do remains unresolved, a permanent feature of modern warfare. The B-52 Stratofortress continues to fly. More than 70 years after its first flight, it has outlasted the Cold War it was designed to fight, the Vietnam War it was adapted to support, and most of the men who flew it in combat. It remains, even now, an awesome instrument of destruction, capable of delivering more explosive force than any other aircraft in the American arsenal. But the machine, however powerful, is only as wise as the decisions that guide its use. The bombers that flew over Vietnam were not defeated by enemy technology or superior tactics. They were defeated by the limits of what destruction alone can accomplish. They were defeated by the resilience of human beings who refuse to submit to force. They were defeated by the gap between what power can destroy and what it can create. This is the enduring lesson of the B-52 campaign over Vietnam. Not that air power is useless. It remains an essential component of modern military capability. Not that the United States was wrong to oppose communist expansion. The Cold War involved genuine conflicts of interest and values. But that power, even overwhelming power, has limits. That there are problems that cannot be solved by bombs, no matter how many are dropped. That the measure of a nation's strength is not only its capacity for destruction, but its wisdom in knowing when destruction serves no purpose. The sky over Vietnam is quiet now. The sound of engines that once brought terror has faded into history. The craters are filling in slowly as the jungle reclaims the land that was torn apart. A new generation has grown up in a country at peace, building lives in places where their grandparents once hid from the bombs. But the lessons written in fire across that landscape have not been erased. They remain, waiting to be learned again by those who believe that enough power can overcome any obstacle. Waiting to remind us that even the mightiest machines are subject to the limits of what force alone can achieve. The B-52s proved that the sky could be made to rain destruction. They also proved that destruction is not the same as victory. And in that contradiction lies a truth that every generation must learn for itself, that power without wisdom is not strength, but tragedy. If you watched this far, it's because this story truly resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and understand who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this video moved you, touched something deep in your understanding of history and humanity, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Every share helps us reach more people who seek to understand, not just to watch. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Here, we don't just tell history. We make you feel its weight, understand its lessons, and carry its wisdom into the present. Subscribe now, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see the world.